All right, everybody. Welcome to the Yes Labels podcast. I'm Justin Clark here with Bill Stepien. Before we start, I just want to say if you like this podcast, please follow it, share it, comment on it, let us know what you think, and tell your friends. We're got a lot of news this week in the political world, where I think we'll continue to have a lot of news in the political world every week, and we're here to analyze some stuff that we think is interesting and hopefully help everybody discern what's going on. Well, this week there was another indictment of former President Trump. He was arraigned yesterday in a D.C. federal courthouse. And this has been a hot topic for a lot of people for a couple of weeks since these indictments started happening. What's your take on the political meaning of all this?
Good morning, Justin. A lot of talk on TV about the indictment and what it means for Trump. A lot of legal talking heads plastered on my TV screen that I can't escape. But there's a lot less talk about what the indictment and the news means for the pure politics of it all, specific to the presidential primary field. And I see two big things from my perspective that I've been thinking a lot about this week. One, what it means for the race, the primary race as a whole, but first, what it means for messaging and how Trump's primary opponents are handling the news on a day-to-day basis. We've sat in presidential campaign headquarters multiple times for Trump. And we know that every campaign starts every day with a neat and tidy communications plan that you want to execute. What do we want to say today in a perfect world? How are we saying it? Where are we saying it? Who's echoing that message? Every campaign does that, or at least they should. Good campaigns do that. They have a week plan. Better campaigns have a monthly plan. Obviously, you need to read and react to the plan, and it's rarely, if ever, it rarely, if ever, goes the way you want. Forget in a month or even a week, but even in a day. But I've been trying to think about how campaigns, Trump's opponents, have been handling this news, and it's a nightmare scenario for these guys, for these candidates. What's not happening today? What didn't happen yesterday? What's not going to happen tomorrow? Right? Ron DeSantis isn't being asked about his record as governor. Nikki Haley isn't being asked about her plan to fix inflation. Tim Scott's not being asked about his plan to stop China. And newsflash, they aren't going to be asked about those things for a long time. They're not going to get the chance to talk about what they want to talk about, what their campaign has planned for them to talk about for a really, really long time. Every single day, instead of talking about what they want to talk about, their message of the day, their message of the week, they're being asked about Donald Trump. Every reporter covering the race is asking them about Donald Trump. And you even have Francis Suarez, who's one of Trump's primary opponents, spending his own campaign dollars. And you don't have a lot of campaign dollars at this point. He's spending his own hard-earned, hard-raised campaign dollars running digital ads that say, "Stand with Trump." That tells you how much of a nightmare that this is for Trump's opponents, that you're actually defending an opponent. You're promoting an opponent. Justin, credit to, and I've never said this before in my life, credit to Will Hurd, who, was out there pretty boldly this week saying that, my words, not his, my paraphrasing, Trump is running for president so he doesn't go to jail. Credit to him for saying what others are thinking and maybe what others need to be saying at this point as it pertains to the indictment news.
Yeah, Governor Christie has made a campaign purportedly about running against Donald Trump and making sure Donald Trump's not president again. The problem he's got is he's kind of wishy-washy. He goes out there and pounds his chest about it, but doesn't say the actual hard-edged word. It's almost like he's trying to split the baby in half. Will Hurd actually, did the thing that he needed to do, and I think that's really, really smart on his end because, as you mentioned, you're not able to cut through anything else. Meaning, this race is about Donald Trump, and if it's about Donald Trump, you don't get to pick what else it's going to be about. So it either needs to be something bad about Trump or something good about Trump that you're going to somehow benefit from. Like you said, it's kind of an impossible situation. I don't know at what point anyone's going to have a chance to talk about anything but that. They've got a debate coming up, but I suspect the number one topic coming out of that debate is going to be Donald Trump. It's a very advantageous position for the Trump campaign and for the former president. And you're right. As long as the topic of conversation is about him, no one else is going to be able to get any traction.
And look, so that's, I mean, that's the messaging fight. That's the knife fighting that occurs on a daily basis of what you want to be talking about, and they're not able to talk about anything they want to talk about overall related to positioning in the race. It's August. I mean, it's not April anymore. It is now getting late or later, at least in the game. And this is a point in time when you look at the polling, which I'm going to ask you about in a second. These candidates need to start breaking through desperately. It is now August, and boy, every time there's an indictment, every time there's big Trump news, it paralyzes this entire field. When this entire field needs to start moving, they don't know
Right.
what to do or how to handle it, as we're talking about, and everyone's doing something different. And I've said before, politics is a copycat sport, and the fact that everyone is approaching this differently, right? You've got Ramaswamy again outside of the courthouse holding press conferences. You've got Hurd saying what he's saying. Uh, you've got Suarez running digital. They're all doing something different because they don't know what to do. Because if one person figured it out, they'd all be doing it. And the result of this is that everyone's paralyzed and it's freezing this race in place, which is a huge advantage for the guy leading the race. I can't speak to the legal side of what's going on, but as for the politics, every night that Trump puts his head on the pillow without losing ground in the primary campaign, it's a winning political day for him. And and the polls continue to show that. And I'll say, putting the primary aside, because Justin, we really haven't seen much movement in the primary race. So
Uh-huh.
putting those primary numbers aside, I'm going to say something counterintuitive that you may or may not agree with. Pertaining to the general election, I'm skipping the primary, going right to the general, Trump versus Biden. I think right now, Donald Trump is in a better position to win the general election than at any point during the 2020 race, and almost at any point during the 2016 race. And that's from two people. That's from me. I can't speak to your view of that. That's from me, who was there for both of those races. And that's not my gut. That's not my instinct. That's data and polling. And I want to ask you about the New York Times Siena poll, which got a lot of coverage this week. They generally do a good job with the numbers they present. So I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about that poll, what you saw, what you wanted to highlight. I dug into the numbers a bit myself, but I wanted to put the ball on the tee for you to address what you saw first.
Yeah, no, I want to get back to I'm going to do that. I want to say that I actually agree with your assessment, and I'll go a step further that I think he's in a position to win. We're going to get into the polling data in a second, but he's I think it's like you said, better position to win at this moment than it was in 2016 or in 2020. And Biden has a lot of fundamental problems. There's not one state that Biden lost in 2020 that he's going to win in 2024. And that's a real problem for him. He's an incumbent, he's got a record, all sorts of fundamentals. But then you actually start taking those qualitative assessments that we're making, a little bit of predictive, trying to predict the horse race. But you take the qualitative pieces and you look at the quantitative stuff, and it's pretty staggering. I mean, the New York Times Siena poll, they
And
released,
Justin, let me give a quick recap to 2020. There was not a single national poll in 2020 that had Trump ahead
right,
of Joe Biden. And
not
I
one.
actually went back and looked this morning at the last 538.com has the all of the national polls from 2020. I'm just going to give you just a quick rundown of the last week of the campaign and what the national poll said. I'm not going to waste time going through the name of the pollster. I'm just going to give the result. All in the last, not even week, the last day or two of the campaign. Biden +3, Biden +10, Biden +9, +8, +7, +8, +7, +7, +5, +4, +2, +5, +4, +11, +12, +11. you get the point. These were all November. These were all polls from November to 2020, and there wasn't a single national poll that had Trump ahead. So that's the recap of what we all lived through a couple years ago.
And just to everyone knows this, the election in 2020 was essentially a tie. No one likes to talk about it, but 2020 was closer than 2016. It just was in terms of the outcome and the electoral component of the electoral votes were actually in inverse of one another. But if you just add up the states and the margins in those states that mattered, it was closer than 2016. So it really just tells a story that he's in a better position than he has been before. Um, so this week, New York Times, Siena College released their poll. They did a national primary survey with Republicans. Donald Trump was well ahead, 54%. Ron DeSantis was at 17, and everyone else was in low single digits. I don't know about you, Bill, but national primary polls really don't tell you much. Primaries are
Mm-hmm.
about we've talked about this. Primaries are about momentum, winning early states. They just don't tell you all that much. They also did a survey of registered voters nationally for the general election, and I do think that does tell you something because it does tell you voter sentiment and how things are moving in one direction or another. This poll, the New York Times Siena poll that was fielded, it looks like July 23rd to the 27th, they released it this week, had it tied. Joe Biden, 43%, Donald Trump, 43%. Some notable things that I just want to kind of pick out, and then I'm going to draw a conclusion. Like you jump in whatever you want at the end here. Some really interesting things that aren't super surprising, but they're interesting nonetheless. So Biden over-indexes his 43% poll number with women at 49%, and only gets 36% of men. Trump over-indexes with men, 50% over his 43% total number, and only gets 37% of women. So there's a real gender gap. No surprises there. That's been there for a while. What I find really interesting about this, though, is the age breaks on this thing. Typically, as voters get older in these types of surveys, they get more conservative, they get more Republican. I say typically, that's just been our experience for the last 30, 40 years. In this survey, that is the case until you get to 65 plus, and Biden leads marginally with that group, which I find very, very interesting. If you look at it, though, if you're 65 plus right now, you were born in 1958 or earlier. So if you're 65 years old, you were born in 1958, which means you were 18 years old in the 70s. You're wearing bell bottoms, you got long hair. You're not what we think of, my age thinks of, as someone who's 65 plus. Those 65-year-olds are aging into, or have aged into, a more conservative cohort, but are actually probably more liberal socially, economically, in every respect than the older ends of that cohort. So we're really seeing a change in what a 65 plus voter looks like. The age group below that, however, trends more Republican. Find it very interesting as we see these changing patterns. If we were to break down what 65 to 75 looked like versus 75 plus, I bet you'd see a huge break and a huge shift. But these old kind of shibboleths about older voters, 65 plus, being more conservative, and you become more conservative when you're older, just isn't the case. We're kind of seeing that turn on its head, among other things in the electorate, including people who are high earners, people making over, in this poll, the New York Times Siena poll, people making over $100,000 a year are voting for Biden. You're seeing just this shift continue in the Republican Party that we've seen for the last 7 years. And what does it mean? Well, what I think it means is that everyone is finding out who their new chunk of voters is. And the person who can message to those voters better, who can put their finger on the pulse of what those voters care about better, again, looking at the right data, looking at the right people, is going to be successful.
Justin, I found the 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 numbers by gender were interesting to me because political pundits always bemoan the gender gap, right? Um, big trouble for Republicans, big trouble for Donald Trump that there's a big gender gap. Women don't vote for him, men do. Well, if you look back to 2020, Trump won men, and this is both of these. This is from CNN's exit polls. Trump won men by 8, 53-45. Trump lost women by 15, +8 among men, -15 among women. Now he's narrowed the gap slightly among women from 15 in 2020 to 12 now, but he's gained 6 among men from 8 +8 in 2020 to +14 now. So if the gender gap exists because you have growing support among men, and by the way, small additional support among women, it's not a terrible thing.
Yeah, their vote,
Um,
men's and women's votes still count equally the last time I checked.
right. So, a growing gender gap isn't a bad thing if you're making the gains he's seeing among men. And that was notable.
And
The,
Bill,
the,
before you
yeah.
before you move on from that, and if there was in 2020, people were trying to figure out what happened and where Trump lost support. And there was this old kind of myth that's kind of stuck that, oh, suburban women were the problem in 2020. No, it was suburban men. He deteriorated among suburban men. So you had voters who voted mostly white men in suburbs who voted for Trump in 2016. And then a cohort of them shifted and voted for Biden in 2020. Those are voters that can come back. And those are voters that I think we're seeing come back in this poll. I think that the number for women is probably stuck where it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree with that. You mentioned, and you went where I was gonna go on income. I actually went back and also looked at 2016, and we look at 3 different income brackets: under 50K, 50K to 100K, and then 100K plus. Um, Under 50K, Trump lost under 50K voters, those who make under 50,000, by 12 points in 2016. He lost by the same number in 2020, 11. Now he's winning by 4. So from
Right.
from -12 in 16, -11 in 20, now it's +4. 50 to 99K, Trump narrowly won in 2016 by 3, lost big among those voters in 2020 by 15, -15. Now he's back to 2016 levels, winning by 4. You ask yourself why that group, right? Boy, hardest hit, very hard hit by inflation. Certainly fueling that bounce back that we're seeing for Trump. And then the 100K voters tied in 2016 on the button. Trump won by 12 in 2020. Those voters loved tax cuts, loved what was happening in the stock market. Now Biden's winning by 6, and time will tell. We've talked a lot about the paradigm shift in the parties. Country club voters used to vote for the GOP, less so these days. We'll see what sticks longer term. But certainly some interesting trends when you look back to 2016 with where people where voters are right now.
Absolutely. And the one thing that every political consultant likes to think that they can control, that voters actually control, is what voters care about at the moment. And these issues, all the issues that we deal with in life and around the world and everything, those issues are going to be decided by voters and what they care about going in the polls on election day. If they're worried about the economy, if voters are worried about the economy when they go in and vote, either future security or their current security or taxes or what inflation or whatever, they're probably going to vote for Donald Trump. If they're not worried about that, these kind of swingy voters, and there aren't a ton of them anymore, are probably going to vote for Joe Biden. It's more complicated than that, but boiled down to its essence, that's what I think it means. The one other thing I want to note in here, Bill, that I found interesting and it shouldn't be surprising to everyone, was religious voters. There's just a widening divide between people who consider themselves religious voters and people who consider themselves non-religious voters. The Democrats are really gobbling up a huge share of non-religious voters. And Republicans are gobbling up a larger and larger and larger share of people who consider themselves religious voters. The reason I think this is interesting is because your traditional breakdowns among Christian denominations or religious denominations really doesn't apply anymore, or it's starting to not apply. Like you don't see very much difference between people who consider themselves Catholics or Protestants in this poll. They're supporting Trump, and I think that kind of sorting of religious voters, it's becoming less about what different congregations are doing, with some notable exceptions, especially in the African American community, but what specific congregations are doing and what people who just consider themselves religious are doing versus people who consider themselves not religious. Muslim, Jew, Christian versus people who just don't identify with religion. And it's a growing number. So that break I find interesting. It's probably not earth-shattering news to anybody, but I think it's going to continue. And rather than a going after a certain sect or group of people, the widening divide is we want to try to get religious voters or not religious voters, and that's going to be the biggest indicia in terms of religion of how people vote.
No doubt. And look, I at times poo-poo national polls, but like you, and I certainly do so for primary elections. Presidential elections are not national elections, but to your point, national polls do tell us something about the environment. They tell us something about trends. Like we talked about in 2020, there wasn't a single national poll that showed Trump ahead. Um, and just this month, there are two national polls that show Trump ahead. um, one by four, one by five, two additional ones, including one of which was the New York Times poll that we've spent time on. Two showed the race tied. So it's a different race. The 2024 race is already a different race than 2020 was. Remember, at this point, and Justin, you and I were sitting in campaign headquarters. At this point, 4 years ago, national polling had Biden up by a lot already. I mean, we're talking the average poll, national poll had Biden winning by high single digits over Trump in the late summer of 2019. So for Trump to be leading 4 years later in these same polls tells you what a difference 4 years makes. And by the way, it's not just national polls. We've talked a lot about national polls today, but we're starting to see some in-state polling that also tells a similar story. Good news for Trump, bad news for Biden. There was a Quinnipiac poll last month that showed Trump beating Biden in Pennsylvania. It was only the second general election poll that ever had Trump ahead of either Biden or Clinton, for that matter. And remember, that's three elections: 2016, 2020, 2024. It's only the second poll ever that showed Trump ahead of Biden either time or Clinton. And there was a poll out just this week in Michigan that showed Trump and Biden tied, in Emerson poll. So stepping
Yeah.
back, sitting in campaign headquarters 4 years ago, I think you or I would have signed up for these numbers, this environment, these trends in a heartbeat.
Now, and in a heartbeat. Yeah, this is really encouraging news for the Trump folks. And just a disclaimer for everybody who's listening who says, polling is broken, polling doesn't work anymore. Polling still does work, and this is probably bias as people who do polling, Bill. But the bigger problem for a lot of people is the data. Uh, when you poll, you base stuff off of models of how people voted previously, and you look at a likely voter screen. And as voting patterns shift, that reflect these shifts in movement, from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican, those data sets lag. So give your pollster a hug. Tell them it'll be okay, and the data will catch up eventually. But before I want to say one thing here, Bill. We talked about a lot about his vote share being better than it was 4 years ago. Right now, it's 100% true. We would have killed for these numbers. Uh, I think you have an incumbent president right now, Joe Biden, and you you know, just from historical purposes, like his vote share is not going to be higher than it was in 2016. Meaning incumbents just don't usually get, in terms of share of the vote, like things become harder on a reelect because you don't have that initial enthusiasm. You know, you've got a record, you've got some baggage with you. This is a really important thing for him to make sure that his base, meaning his core group of supporters, Democrats, hardcore Democrats, vote for him. And in this New York Times Siena poll, you're seeing an issue with him for there. Trump, in terms of the share of his base, in terms of voters, is at 88% of Republicans. Biden's at 83. Regardless of whether those numbers come to pass, what that shows is that people aren't enthusiastic about Joe Biden, which means turnout deteriorates among your voting base. And in places like Michigan, which in 2016, Bill, we saw it firsthand, you need that because there's a certain number of raw votes you need to get out of certain places if you're the Democratic candidate or if you're a Republican candidate, but that you need to get out of concentrated groups of folks, especially in urban areas, that an 83% share tells me you're not getting all those people again. That number needs to come way up for him or he's going to have a real problem.
Well, Justin, to your point about Democrat enthusiasm for Biden, I'm looking at uh, that same state of Michigan, same poll, Emerson poll. Biden in the Democrat primary, Biden's at 65. Crackpot Marianne Williamson's at 11, and Kennedy is at 5. So for Biden to be at 65 in his own primary, those are numbers that Trump never had, issues that Trump never had in his own backyard, in his own primary base in 2020. Biden seemingly has some of those.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
And to your
it's a real
point,
problem.
it is going to be a different election for Joe Biden. 2024 completely different. 2020 was a referendum on Donald Trump, thumbs up or thumbs down on Donald Trump's 4 years. It's not going to be a traditional incumbent versus challenger race in 2024, assuming Trump is the nominee, because Trump is obviously a former president. Um, but Biden's not going to have the ability to just run as a challenger as he did last time. And to your point about when incumbent presidents lose, they usually lose in landslide elections, right? Because the tidal wave of public opinion turned in a big way against them. Bush 92, Carter 80, Hoover all the way back in the 30s. They all got steamrolled in their reelect because big events caused big turns in public opinion. And even with COVID occurring, a pretty massive historic event, massive shifting didn't occur in 2020. To your point, 20 was closer than 16. A few votes shifted from 16 to 20, not some massive groundswell of public opinion turning against Trump,
Yeah.
like Bush, like Carter, like Hoover. Those votes can shift back. And look, a big part of that is that news of the day, big or small, going back to where we started with the indictment, news of the day, big or small, really doesn't dent Trump's image because after, do my math, 35 years, 40 years in the public eye, opinions on Trump are mainly baked in. I mean, the guy was on Oprah in the 80s. So there aren't a lot of surprises after any 35 or 40-year relationship. And it's why I think there's such a firmness to public view of him when news like an indictment occurs.
That's right. And Bill, you mentioned, big news. You're 100% right. His image is pretty static at this point. I mean, everyone's got an opinion on him. What I find interesting, going back to your point about big events, moving things and incumbents usually losing by big numbers. The other thing is incumbents usually don't lose. But when they do, primary problems, base problems are usually a leading indicator of what's happening. You had it in 92, you had it in 80, you had it in going all the way back to 1912. So the point is they are usually a leading indicator. And here in the Democratic primary, yeah, you're showing you mentioned some pretty bad numbers for Biden that are probably a leading indicator of that enthusiasm problem. And what I would say is if you go into the crosstabs on this poll, you'll see that 13% that RFK has among self-identified Democrats, 71% of those voters said they voted for Trump in 2020. Okay. So I discount it a little bit, but what I don't discount is when they asked the next question, which was 45%, or would you nominate a different person in 2024? 45% said they'd renominate Biden. 50% they said they want someone else. That's not an RFK Trump effect. 46% of those 50% who want someone else voted for Biden. That's an enthusiasm problem. They don't like it. And it's a potential leading indicator of something bigger, some bigger shift that can overwhelm an incumbent.
Keeping the base stoked is a big challenge for any reelect. It was something that Trump never had to face.
That's right.
Heading into 2020. But you know, Bush 04, I was a part of that campaign. It was, your base, your activists, your volunteers, your donors, you're in charge, you're in the White House, the spoils of office, you get a little fat, dumb, and happy and a little lazy.
Yep.
It was never
That's
the
right.
case with Trump's base. I think you're seeing some of that with the Democrat base right now.
That's exactly right. All right. I think we're going to wrap this episode up here. Just a preview for listeners for next week. We do a monthly Republican primary survey in South Carolina. We've done it for the last several months. We will be releasing our numbers on this podcast next week. Tune in. We'll walk through them and let you know where the Republican primary race stands in South Carolina. If you liked what you heard today, like our podcast, follow it, share it with your friends, and comment on it. In the meantime, we'll see you all next week. Later, everybody.